These are the journeys of the children of Israel, when they went out of the land of Egypt, by their armies, under the hand of Moses and Aaron. Moses wrote the starting points of their journeys, by the commandment of Yahweh. These are their journeys according to their starting points. They travelled from Rameses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. On the next day after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with a high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians, while the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom Yahweh had struck among them. Yahweh also executed judgments on their gods. The children of Israel travelled from Rameses and encamped in Succoth. They travelled from Succoth and encamped in Etham, which is in the edge of the wilderness. They travelled from Etham and turned back to Pihahiroth, which is before Baal-zephon, and they encamped before Migdol. They travelled from before Hahiroth and crossed through the middle of the sea into the wilderness. They went 3 days' journey in the wilderness of Etham and encamped in Marah. They travelled from Marah and came to Elim. In Elim there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there. They travelled from Elim and encamped by the Red Sea. They travelled from the Red Sea and encamped in the wilderness of Sin. They travelled from the wilderness of Sin and encamped in Dophkah. They travelled from Dophkah and encamped in Alush. They travelled from Alush and encamped in Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. They travelled from Rephidim and encamped in the wilderness of Sinai. They travelled from the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in Kibroth Hattava. They travelled from Kibroth Hattava and encamped in Hazeroth. They travelled from Hazeroth and encamped in Rithmah. They travelled from Rithmah and encamped in Rimmon Perez. They travelled from Rimmon Perez and encamped in Libnah. They travelled from Libnah and encamped in Rissah. They travelled from Rissah and encamped in Kehelatha. They travelled from Kehelatha and encamped in Mount Shephar. They travelled from Mount Shephar and encamped in Harada. They travelled from Harada and encamped in Makaloth. They travelled from Makaloth and encamped in Tahath. They travelled from Tahath and encamped in Terah. They travelled from Terah and encamped in Mithkah. They travelled from Mithkah and encamped in Hashmonah. They travelled from Hashmonah and encamped in Moseroth. They travelled from Moseroth and encamped in Bene Yakan. They travelled from Bene Yakan and encamped in Hor Haggidgad. They travelled from Hor Haggidgad and encamped in Jotbatha. They travelled from Jotbatha and encamped in Abrona. They travelled from Abrona and encamped in Ezion-Geber. They travelled from Ezion-Geber and encamped at Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. They travelled from Kadesh and encamped in Mount Hor, in the edge of the land of Edom. Aaron the priest went up into Mount Hor at the commandment of Yahweh, and died there in the 40th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 5th month, on the 1st day of the month. Aaron was 123 years old when he died in Mount Hor. The Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the south in the land of Canaan, heard of the coming of the children of Israel. They travelled from Mount Hor and encamped in Zalmonah. They travelled from Zalmonah and encamped in Punon. They travelled from Punon and encamped in Oboth. They travelled from Oboth and encamped in Abarim, in the border of Moab. They travelled from Ayim and encamped in Dibon-Gad. They travelled from Dibon-Gad and encamped in Almon-Diblathaim. They travelled from Almon-Diblathaim and encamped in the mountains of Abarim before Nebo. They travelled from the mountains of Abarim and encamped in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. They encamped by the Jordan from Beth-Jeshemoth even to Abel-Shittim in the plains of Moab. Yahweh spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, and tell them, when you pass over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, destroy all their stone idols, destroy all their molten images, and demolish all their high places. You shall take possession of the land and dwell therein, for I have given the land to you to possess it. You shall inherit the land by lot according to your families. To the larger groups you shall give a larger inheritance, and to the smaller you shall give a smaller inheritance. Wherever the lot falls to any man, that shall be his. You shall inherit according to the tribes of your fathers. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those you let remain of them will be like pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will harass you in the land in which you dwell. It shall happen that as I thought to do to them, so I will do to you.